Hello, everyone. Welcome to our live. While we're allowing a few people to join, please answer our question in the comments. What's more expensive to a small business, losing a really good employee or keeping a really bad manager? If you'll just put your answer in the comments, we'll give everybody a few minutes to get in and then we'll get started. Hey everyone, if you're just getting here, we have just a question up on the screen. We're going to get started in just a minute. But what do you think is more expensive to a small business? Losing a really good employee or keeping a really bad manager? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Hey everyone, welcome to our live. I'm so thankful that you are here. My name is Sabrina Baker. I am the founder and CEO of Acacia HR Solutions, and we are a fractional HR support firm that partners with small businesses. Those businesses usually have between 1 and 500 employees. We don't really care about revenue. We don't care about industry, any of those things. It is strictly about the employee population. And our fractional HR support model takes us inside of client businesses, acting as an extension of either their leadership team or their HR team. So for that smaller end of the 1 to 500, we often become their entire leadership team, and we are working directly with, we are their entire HR team, and we're working directly with their leadership to manage their human resources infrastructure and build an infrastructure that's both strategic and compliant. And then on the larger end of that 1 to 500, if they already have an HR director or an HR manager, then we would come in and support that. We would supplement their HR team. So rather than needing to hire all of these other individuals that they typically don't have the budget for, they could use our fractional support service, get all of those experts wrapped into a small extension of their team. And so doing that for 14, almost 15 years now has really taught us what is driving to a small business and what is absolutely draining to a small business. And this topic today, bad managers inside of small businesses, we know, and I'm sure you know, is one that is absolutely draining. And I don't know that we talk about it enough, and I don't know that we fully understand all of the consequences of having bad managers inside of a small business. If you have heard me speak, if you listen to the HR Connection podcast, if you've ever talked to me, then you have likely heard my analogy around small businesses, working inside of a small business, being very similar to living inside of a small town. Everyone knows everyone. Everybody is in everybody else's business. The same person who takes your baggage is also the person who flies the plane, if there's even an airport. The mayor is also the preacher. Everybody's somehow related. It's really like living in a small space. And because of that, you can have very large ripple effects from small events. So you can have very positive ripple effects and you can have very negative ripple effects that affect the whole population. And I think in small businesses, the bad manager is certainly one of those areas that can have this massive ripple effect across the entire org. While we're on this live, you have access to the comments. I can't see all of them. Sometimes the way LinkedIn shares them, it's hard for me to see all of them, but certainly if you want to pop in a question, we'll leave some time for Q&A at the end, or just leave your thoughts. I don't think that I am the expert on everything. And certainly in this topic, there's a lot of nuance and a lot of other things that come into play. So if you are inside of a small business and you have thoughts and ideas and things that people can learn from, I would love for you to share them so that others can learn as well. Today, I'm going to be breaking down a couple different things. The first one is, what is a bad manager? Like, how do we define that? I think there's an obvious answer, and there's probably a person that comes to mind for you. But I think there are actually a few different archetypes that I want to share that I think make up a bad manager inside of a small business. And then I want to talk about costs, because this is costly. And so there are direct costs that if I were to say to you right now, what do you think a bad manager costs? You would probably give me some metrics and some things that definitely they are impacting, but I think there's some indirect costs. And I think some of those we don't even think about, and we definitely don't talk about. And if we did, it might change the focus or the willingness to actually make change with this bad manager. And then because of that, I think it's important to talk about the why. So the reason that bad managers or ineffective managers get to stick around in a small business, there are two main reasons that I have seen in the last 14 years of doing this. And both of them are sometimes really hard to overcome. It takes a little bit of time to overcome that. And then the last thing, of course, which is probably why you are here, is to talk about what can we even do about it? What can we as HR do about it? What can we do if we don't have the influence or the title or the power to do anything about it? But then also, what can we do if we're not even HR or we're not even a leader? I know we have some who might be listening that are just you're dealing with this, you're dealing with a bad manager, and you're wondering if there's anything that you can do about it. And so I'm going to try and give a few ideas on what we can do when we're kind of influencing from the middle. We don't have the direct opportunity to influence, but we're trying to influence from the middle, which is, I think, where a lot of HR leaders in small businesses sit. And then certainly a lot of employees who don't necessarily have a leadership title sit. So hopefully that is going to be a good flow. Let's jump into it. So the first thing that I wanted to do is call out the archetypes. So we do have 3 archetypes of bad managers in a small business. I think the first one, if I were to ask you to name one, you could give that to me, no problem. And that is going to be your toxic bully, right? This is the person who is leading from ego. They lead through threat, fear, and intimidation. They do not care about anybody's feelings. They feel like their title and their role gives them the power to do whatever they want. They are kind of sometimes very power hungry. They are absolute bullies, and they are causing psychological harm. They are causing this really mental decay inside the business because of the way that they lead or don't lead. So I think that's an obvious one that we could point out. If we walked into any business today and saw somebody acting in that manner, then we would know absolutely that is a bad manager. That's a toxic person. But I think there are two more that we don't always talk about. And I think that they can do just as much harm, but just in a different way. So the second archetype would be the ineffective manager. This is somebody who doesn't know how to delegate. They don't know how to give feedback. They refuse to hold people accountable. This could be like a micromanager. It's somebody who is in this management role. They have some idea. They're not necessarily leading through threat and fear and intimidation. They're not necessarily toxic or causing this psychological harm, but they're really not effective. What they are doing is not developing the business. It's not moving anything forward. They are almost still acting like an individual contributor, even though they've got this team around them. And so they're really ineffective in what they're doing. And then the third archetype is unprepared. And this is somebody who is newly promoted. We see this quite a bit. I talk a lot about homegrown leaders inside of a small business. It is very common. It's this case in my business where you have people who come in and they kind of grow up in your business as leaders, and they've never been given the opportunity to develop. There's no support. They're just kind of like, hey, you're really good at your job as an individual contributor. Now I'm going to give you this team, but they're never told what that means. They're never told how to do that. What does it mean going from peer to supervisor? What does it mean to lead people and develop people? Typically, when I am talking about managers and leaders, I differentiate between the two. I think managers manage tasks. They move through the business by managing tasks. They lead with their authority based on their role or their title, their position, where leaders are actually interested in developing and empowering and inspiring and in moving through the business because people find them influential and people find them as a mentor and they want to follow them and they want to grow and develop because of that person. So normally in these conversations, and especially as I think about these archetypes, I would typically differentiate between manager and leader. But I think as we look at the three that I just listed, they're interchangeable. You could have a manager doing these things. You could have a leader doing these things. And so I'm going to use those words interchangeably today. The point is that you have somebody in a position of power, somebody who has a team that is reporting to them or some level of responsibility, and they are either straight up toxic, straight up bullies, or they are ineffective because they won't do leadership type things like accountability, feedback, delegation, development, or you have somebody who is completely unprepared. They were thrown into a role because they were good at one thing and they're really no support, no training, absolutely no development, and they just don't know what they're supposed to be doing. And so when you look at your business, sometimes I will go into a client and they'll say, oh, we've got this one bad manager, and that is the person who is toxic. That is the person who is bullying, and they are yelling and they are doing all of these things. And when I get into the business, I'll say, you actually have a few. And I think we throw it off a little bit, maybe because we use the word bad manager. At least the last two archetypes, they don't mean to do harm. They're not trying to do something bad. Their intentions are usually good. They just, again, don't know better, or they're only doing what they have been taught from their own leadership. But really, we have to look at all of these. If you are in a small environment and you have managers who are ineffective or who are unprepared, that is just as bad as having a bully. It does harm the business. It harms it differently, but it still has this harm and long-term effect on the business that you're trying to grow. So let's talk about some costs. As I think about cost for having bad managers, toxic managers, ineffective managers, I think there are a couple of direct costs that you could probably rattle off to me pretty easily. But then I think there are a few indirect costs that we never talk about that can be really impactful. So direct costs are this. We have turnover and recruitment. Those are obvious. When you have especially a super toxic individual, a super toxic manager, then they are probably going to have high turnover. We're definitely going to have low engagement, and you have cost associated with that. I saw estimates recently that replacing employees now costs between 50 and 150% of their salary. So depending on where that falls, you can certainly do the math and figure out what it costs you in your business. But if you think about that, a person who is making $100,000, the cost to replace them could be as low as $50,000. Even that in a small business is detrimental to a budget. And so when you think about all of the things that goes into replacing somebody, you have the fact that they leave and they leave the remaining employees to take on that work. So they're less productive or they're overworked. So we're losing engagement, we're losing efficiency, we're probably losing quality for a period of time. Then you have the recruitment cost of replacing that person. So just the hours it takes to post a job, interview, screen resumes, go through that entire process. And then the onboarding costs, right? So finally we find somebody, which could take a while. We find the person, we get them in. They're not going to hit the ground running from day one, or they shouldn't be expected to. We should give them some ramp time. We should give them some training time. So replacing one person can cost a business so much money just in those direct costs. And if you have a manager who, because of their ineffectiveness, because they were unprepared to be one, or because they are a flat out toxic bully, is just churning and burning through employees, then the cost that is hitting the company over and over again can really be detrimental and absolutely stagnate any kind of growth they're trying to do. So those are direct costs. I think there are a few indirect costs. And I think sometimes that these are hard. We don't talk about them because it's hard to put a number behind them. It's hard to put a metric around them, but I think that they can be more detrimental sometimes than even the direct cost. So the first indirect cost is in culture. As I said earlier, being inside of a small business, you are like living in a small town, right? And so you have these ripple effects. If you think about a very small town, I grew up in Kentucky, small towns all around. If you think about a small town, if you have something like a Walmart or an Amazon warehouse, something really large come into that small town, the ripple effect is amazing. You've got all these jobs. You have, maybe lower places that you can shop now that are lower prices. You have all of these opportunities by just those companies coming in and setting up shop in that small town. But then they leave. Right? The Walmart decides to take their company elsewhere and their shop elsewhere, and they leave, and the ripple effect hits the negative side. Now we've lost all of these jobs. Now we've lost somewhere else that we could potentially shop. And the same thing happens with managers in a small business. If you have leaders who are phenomenal, if you have a few leaders who are really leading, they're really helping develop, they're empowering, they're really creating this structure and this environment and this employee experience that is super positive, that can have a positive ripple effect. But then if you have managers who are toxic or ineffective or unprepared, that's also going to have a ripple effect. In a larger organization, teams can absorb this better, right? You have one department who has a bad manager, it's probably not going to spread into the entire organization. But in a small business, and especially if we're talking like under 100, that's going to spread. It's going to have this ripple effect. And I would say that while a great leader can have a positive ripple effect, the effect that a bad manager is going to have is going to be much greater, because we tend to focus on the negative, unfortunately. And that tends to be like what comes top of mind for us. So we have this culture and engagement effect where people are not being as effective as they can be. Maybe their quality of work is diminished. They're not being efficient. They're not engaged. They could really care less about the work because this person isn't really leading in a way that is helpful to them. So I think culture erosion is the first indirect cost. The second indirect cost would be an employer brand. And this is one we never talk about in small businesses. When I start to talk about employer brand, most small business leaders kind of roll their eyes because they don't think this is for them. They think that it's a big picture, big business type of strategy, and it doesn't really apply to them. And I will tell you that that is wrong. It is really, really false. In a small business, you have an employer brand, whether you curated one or not. And what people see externally determines whether they're going to apply for a job with your organization or not. Many years ago, I'm old enough to remember when social media didn't exist. Just mind your business about my age, but I'm old enough to remember when social media didn't exist and companies could just have a website. They could have a website and they could have a careers page. And if they had that, then candidates would go and they would look at it and they would decide from there whether they were going to apply for a job or not. Now, candidates are not only looking at your website. if they are even looking at your website, they're looking at LinkedIn, they're looking at Glassdoor, they're searching your company name to see if there are any videos out there, maybe that an employee recorded of you firing them on TikTok, right? So there are so many places now that potential employees are searching to find out about who you are. Small businesses are already behind. We're already behind in what we can pay typically, the benefits that we can offer, and the fact that small businesses are typically seen as volatile, right? The path to profitability, if it's a startup situation, that's really hard. And so if they're in that space, it can be difficult for people to want to take that chance because small businesses typically can be the first to have layoffs, especially if you have something like a COVID or just a bad economic time, then small businesses are hit the hardest. And so we're already behind the 8 ball in trying to get people into our business. And then you go and throw a negative employer brand out there. You go and you have some negative Glassdoor reviews, or you do have a video that an employee took of a manager terminating them or doing layoffs by text or whatever it is. And now suddenly that's viral on TikTok. I think small businesses don't think that's ever going to happen to them. I can tell you we've had clients have it happen to them where employees absolutely recorded a layoff or a termination and out on the internet it went. And so I think that when you have a bad manager, there's so much risk associated with just what they're doing internally, but I think we forget about there's an external risk as well. And there is a picture that is being painted potentially outside in the world that's going to make it difficult for us to even replace the employees that manager is driving off. So it's kind of this awful cycle. And then the third indirect cost is in leadership credibility. When you are in a small business, everybody is watching leadership. All eyes are on that CEO, founder, that main leadership team to see, do they do what they say they're going to do? And if you have a CEO, a founder who says, we are great communicators, we are collaborative, we trust our employees, and then you have a manager who's micromanaging or doesn't communicate or is yelling and screaming all the time, then that really goes against what the CEO is saying the business is. And you have this credibility issue where one person can really affect the credibility of the entire leadership team. And suddenly nobody believes you anymore when you say that we communicate well or that we trust our employees, because you've got somebody who is really, really bringing that whole picture of what the values are down. And so in a small business, you have most have their values, they have what they believe the culture and the employee experience is. But if leaders aren't modeling that, all of the leaders aren't modeling that at all times, then it does affect the credibility of every other leader inside the organization. So you have your direct costs, your turnover, your recruiting. That's easy to quantify. It's easy to figure out what is our cost to replace an employee, what does it cost us in productivity and ramp up time and recruiting costs and all of that stuff. But then you have your indirect cost that is sometimes a little bit harder to quantify, but is just as important. It is affecting the business just as much and leading to potential greater risk and potential lower ROI on what you're doing down the road. So before I get into what do I think HR can do, what do I think that we can try, some of the things that we've tried over the years, I wanted to first talk about why this happens. When I first started the business, I was not working in small businesses. I was working in large organizations. My corporate HR career had been in businesses from 3,000 to 125,000 employees, and never with a founder. I think that a founder really changes the game. When you have somebody who built the business and they are your leader, that's a different atmosphere than sitting in a 100,000 employee situation or even 10,000 employee situation where the founder might still be around, but they have this whole leadership team really executing. When you're in a small business and you're dealing mostly with a founder, you have some emotions in there that don't exist in larger organizations. This is like a child. I have a whole speech that I do. I think we even did a podcast episode on the difference between CEO that came in after or a founder that's the CEO. And when you are dealing with a founder who is the CEO, the business is like their child. So if you're going to come to them and say, hey, this person's bad or this is not working, you have to understand that you're talking about their kids. You're talking about their children, and you have to be able to come at it from that way. And when I first realized that in managing the business, I realized that I'm always going to have to figure out their why. I'm always going to have to figure out where they're coming from. And when it comes to bad managers, whether they be toxic, ineffective, or unprepared, there are two major reasons that I see CEOs, especially CEOs who are founders, not wanting to address this at all. And the first one is loyalty, this misplaced sense of loyalty because that person was with them from the beginning. So if you have a startup situation and the person was hired really early on in the first days, then the longer they're with that CEO founder, the more loyalty that person has to them because they stuck around when things were really hard. We have had clients that are startups over the years, and it's a tough situation. You don't know if you're getting the funding, you're waiting on funding, then you get the funding, and then you have to do all of the things to get to profitability, and that could take a few years. And in the meantime, you're making all of these promises to employees about when we get there, here's what I'm going to give you, but not everybody's willing to wait. And so the people who do, the people that are there when they're building, they're just creating something from nothing, those people get this loyalty from the CEO that makes it really difficult for that CEO to address bad behavior. So when you have a CEO and you have an employee or a leader that is a bad manager and you go to that CEO, oftentimes they're going to shut that down because they're very loyal to that person who stuck with them. And I've seen this not just in startups. So startups is usually where it's most prevalent, where they were with me in the beginning, so I'm not going to do anything about it. But I've also seen this when you have small businesses go through economic downturns. So during COVID would be a great example of a time where some of our clients had to do furloughs, or they had to ask their staff to take pay cuts during just that time. And those people who are willing to do that have gained this loyalty from the CEO that now they feel guilty if they have to address bad behavior. So the first reason that I think it's really hard sometimes for CEOs to address bad behavior in one of their leaders is because they have this loyalty to that person. I've literally had CEOs look me in the eye and say, I know they're not effective, but they were with me when we were doing this. They moved across the world for me. They did all of this on their own dime. They did all of this. I'm going to have a hard time holding them accountable to something else. I'm going to have a hard time giving them feedback, and I'm certainly going to have a hard time letting them go. So if you're dealing with this kind of loyalty situation, that piece takes a lot of time because you are breaking through emotions that they have about the person. It's not just it's not as easy to be so straightforward about it because they have emotions and this loyalty towards that individual. And then the second reason that I find that CEOs sometimes have a really hard time addressing bad behavior, and I think this one's probably the most common, is because the person who has the bad behavior also has knowledge that no one else has. So again, we are living in homegrown situations. You have in small businesses, there's no blueprint. I can tell you from starting a business, nobody gave me a manual. Nobody told me how to do this. I have just figured it out as I've gone. And I am sure that in some of our areas, we are not doing it the way that is standard. We are not doing it the way that a big business person might do it. We're doing it in a way that has worked for us or that is working for us. And when you're the person building that, then you have the knowledge of how that works. And then leaders, when you are a bad leader in that, they have a really hard time letting you go because you have so much knowledge. And this is one of those things that we see quite often, and we have to talk to our CEO clients about, which is, I get that they have all this knowledge, but let's figure out how to get it, because they are causing you issues in so many other parts of the business because of their behavior, because they are absolutely toxic. In leadership training, one of the things that I talk about quite a bit is personality. And I talk about how personality affects how people feel about the workplace and how they feel about the work. And I use the example of Sheldon Cooper from The Big Bang Theory. You have somebody who, for all intents and purposes, is a great performer. I'm sure Sheldon knocks his performance reviews from a performance standpoint out of the park. He's hitting all his goals. He's going above and beyond. But from that personality standpoint, he is toxic. No one wants to work with him. He's really difficult to work with. And you can't allow in a small environment those people to stay for a long time in that way. If they're not willing to change, I do believe they have to be moved out of the business. But the thought of losing all of that knowledge, losing all of that performance, all of those goals, that's really difficult for leaders to overcome. And so getting through to them that we have to figure out how to either get them to evolve into a different place of their leadership, or we're going to have to move them out of the business and figure out that knowledge they have. That can be really, really hard, and it can really shut them down from even wanting to have the conversation. So I'm sure that there are more reasons, but really what I see as the biggest two reasons why CEOs, and especially CEOs who are founders, do not want to address this is because one, they have this loyalty to the individual if that person was with them for a long time. I'll tell you, we have small businesses that they're not even founder led, but the people inside have been with them for 20, 30 years. And there is just this great loyalty that happens. And I get that. But if they are affecting your business negatively, you have to figure out how to be able to address it. So there's this misplaced sense of loyalty, or they have this knowledge and only they have this knowledge. And if they left without sharing that knowledge, it would be really detrimental to the business. And when you have one of those two things that are existing, then the way that you have to go about addressing it has to be really sensitive, because you are dealing with some really emotional stuff. So I wanted to bring that up because if you are sitting in HR, you are dealing with a bad manager, I want you to think about, does one of those two things exist? Are we resistant to hold them accountable and to give them feedback because of some loyalty, or because they have some knowledge that we need? And if it is one of those two things, then I'm just going to be really honest and tell you that usually takes longer to overcome. It takes more conversations. It takes strategy. It really takes that mindset of the CEO to shift a little bit and realize that even though they were with you in the beginning, doesn't mean they're the right person now. Or yes, they do have all of this knowledge, but we can probably either bring somebody in that has different knowledge that might be better, or we can somehow make sure that we are sharing the knowledge that they have. So think about the two whys there. Okay, finally, to the good stuff, which is what can we even do about it? What are some things that I have learned in all of these years in managing CEOs and founders and trying to work through toxic, inefficient, or unprepared managers? So the first thing and the biggest thing is facts over feelings. I said that this misplaced loyalty is a very emotional state, and you have to remove the emotion from that. You have to be able to focus on the data. What do we know to be true? And what you know to be true are your turnover numbers, your engagement survey numbers, or your engagement survey numbers or comments, your exit surveys, your skip levels, if you're able to do those, any kind of hard data that you can get. I have found over and over that if I just go to a CEO and I say, so-and-so is a really bad leader and they're affecting your business, it's easy for them to shut that down, especially if that person is toxic, because in HR, they think we just want everybody to be nice. We just want everybody to be kind. And so we're just too sensitive about it. But if I go with data and I say, here's the turnover in that department alone, here's what the engagement surveys are telling us about that manager, here's some specific comments that have been made about that manager who may not even report to that person. If I can go in with some facts over feelings, just straight data about what we know to be true, they are much more willing to listen to whatever it is that I have to say. You then turn that data into terms that they will understand. So ROI, cost, risk, right? Instead of saying we lost 3 marketing specialists last month, you say we lost 3 marketing specialists. It's going to cost us $60,000 to replace them. That is going to perk up any small business leader's brain, any of them. So making sure that you are removing any emotion that you have and trying not to work through any emotion that they have. So if they have the loyalty, if they have this knowledge that they're afraid of letting go, you're not even going to try and work through that. That's not something you're able to do. What you are able to do is share facts and data around what do we know to be true and what can we prove quantifiably. I do believe that every small business should be doing engagement surveys, exit interviews, and skip levels when they can. Now, I understand that if you are super small, if you're like 20 employees, it's hard to do an engagement survey because even though it's anonymous, you're probably going to be able to figure out who said what. In that case, I suggest focus groups. There are definitely ways that you can get the data without doing a hard engagement survey. So thinking about in your small business, are we doing engagement surveys? Are we doing exit interviews of every person that leaves? And are we doing skip levels when we can, meaning maybe a director is meeting with their reports 2 levels down, or HR is meeting with employees or other levels, then I think that however you can collect as much data as possible, that's what is going to trigger a CEO or a founder definitely to pay attention to what you're saying about that negative manager. The next thing is some of you might be saying, that's great, but I'm not HR or I don't have that power or whatever. So then you need to gain allies. There's no way that if you have a bad manager in the business, you're the only one who thinks so. There's no way that you're the only one who sees that. And if you are, then you might have to reevaluate what you're thinking if everybody else feels differently. But more than likely, there are definitely other leaders, other managers who think the way that you're thinking. And so it's important to think about how can you talk about it with them so that now maybe they have the power to go to the CEO and say these things. In human resources, in a small business, if you do not report to the CEO, then definitely your power, your ability to move things forward is lacking. I put a post on LinkedIn recently that said, if you don't report to the CEO, you're not really leading HR, you're running a service desk. And that's kind of what it is. And so the advice that I always give to those people who are trying to lead and influence from the middle is find out who your allies are. There are likely other leaders who agree with you, and maybe they have the ear of the CEO. And so while you do have to be delicate about this, and I'm certainly not suggesting you just go and start bashing another person in the business and talking about how awful they are in hopes that they will take that to the CEO, I do think that you can find who your allies are and go and talk to them about what you're seeing. Again, with whatever data you have, what are you seeing and what do they think is contributing and what can we do about it? Is there anything that can be done about it? So if you have the power, you take the data, you tell the story straight to the CEO yourself. If you don't, then you find those allies, those people who are going to be on your side with this, and you leverage them. You think about how you can leverage them to get the message where you need it to go. And sometimes that takes a couple of levels, right? Like it's like the six degrees of Kevin Bacon or something, because sometimes maybe the first person you have that allyship with doesn't have the power, but they have somebody who has an allyship with the next person. So again, it's kind of a strategic situation that you have to work through, but finding those people that are going to help you raise the voice that needs to be raised to make everybody aware that we've got a bad situation here is going to be really, really important. And then the last piece, or actually I have 2 more, but one piece that I want to make sure I share is that you don't want to give up on this. I don't want to act like this is a quick fix. I don't want to act like you're going to be able to walk into your CEO's office tomorrow and say, this person is ineffective. Here's all their turnover data. And they're going to be like, yep, let's go. Let's give them some feedback or let's give them some training. They're probably not. It's probably going to take a while. I have worked inside of client businesses where it took us 2 years for the founder to realize that somebody on their leadership team was really causing damage inside their business. And it wasn't until we had repeated engagement surveys and repeated exit interviews and multiple employees and leaders speaking up about this person before the founder finally said, okay, yes, I understand. So this is not a quick fix and you can't give up. You have to keep working different angles. It's not that you're going to want to beat a dead horse. You're not going to want to go in every single day and bring this up. But when you have the opportunity to do so, you want to make sure you do. So if they shut you down the first time and then a few months later that manager loses another employee, or they do something that now could be considered harassment or retaliation, you bring it up again and you try to work whatever different angle. You never know what's going to kind of trigger in a CEO's mind to say, okay, we need to do something about this. And so you just keep working the different angles and continue to work through the process with the person who has the power until they finally do realize, okay, yep, this is a bad situation. And while I want to tell you it takes time, I also want to tell you that I've never seen it not happen. meaning that when we come in and we bring a voice to the fact that, hey, this is really not good leadership. It was happening before because nobody was calling it out. But then when we come in and we say, hey, this is really not great leadership, over time, I've never had a founder stick. I've never had a CEO or a leader stick and refuse to see what is right in front of them, as long as we continue to be able to provide the data and provide the storytelling about what it is potentially costing their business. So not a quick fix, but I usually find that there is a way to finally get through to the person that we need to do something about this. And then the last thing that you can do is curate your own leadership moments. I don't think that you have to be in a position of power to do this. The cool thing about small businesses is that I think everybody has power and everybody has influence and everybody has a voice. That CEO doesn't want to lose anybody. That, again, those turnover costs, those recruiting costs, they're expensive. They know that. And so they want to keep everybody inside of the business, assuming that everybody is working and doing what they need to be doing. And so anybody in whatever position you're in, you can have a voice around this and you can curate leadership moments that might stick. And so here's a few really simple ideas. I've been training leadership development for 14 years now, and I will tell you that something that really resonates with people is quotes, leadership quotes. I always include quotes in my leadership development classes. It's so simple, but sometimes just seeing words in a nice quote can really trigger something in people's minds. And so you can send out leadership quotes, tack them around maybe your conference room where you have your leadership meetings. You can share blogs or podcasts or books that you think are really helpful and talk about how it helped you in your leadership. What I have found is that 99% of the time, if they are on the ineffective or the unprepared time, they've never been taught differently. No one's ever developed them. No one's ever asked them to think about their leadership. And the minute you start talking about it and you say, oh, this podcast was really interesting and it's kind of changed the way that I think about my leadership, it triggers something in them to say, oh, I've never even thought about my leadership. I don't even know what my leadership style is. And then they might start learning on their own. And so having conversations around what kind of leaders do we want to be? And I really think that communication is important and collaboration. And just sometimes those really small micro influences can add up over time that can absolutely change the game. The other thing that I would do in this, if you are comfortable, is coach that person yourself. So certainly when we go in, if we have a leader who is not leading in a way that we think is helpful, then I have no problem saying that to that individual. Again, that is based on our relationship with the client. And so I know that not everybody has that ability or wants to be able to do that, or they feel like maybe it would just cause a confrontation. But if you feel like you could say to that individual, hey, if you would give so-and-so some feedback, then we would probably fix this other problem that you're having. Showing them the connection between what they're not doing and what they're hoping happens sometimes is that spark that you need to get them to really turn around what they're doing. I have really seen these micro influences shift an entire room. So while they seem silly or they seem easy, the reality is that they can make a huge difference when they are done consistently and deliberately. So let's say you get through all of this and you finally get your leader to agree, yes, there's a problem. What now? So I have a couple quick suggestions and then I'm gonna take some questions. The first one is that if that leader is toxic, they probably need to be moved out of the business. I have not, in all of my 14 years, seen a toxic, like a true bully, somebody who's really leading through threat, fear, and intimidation. I have not seen them turn themselves around. We have tried, we have done individual coaching, we've given them a ton of resources, but I have never seen somebody willing to turn around long-term. They may be better for a little while. I'm not saying it can't be done. I'm not saying it can't, but I am saying that's really, really difficult. And it takes a lot of ownership and vulnerability on their part that they're usually not willing to give. Also, they've done a lot of damage. And so inside the business, even if they were to go through leadership coaching and go through a situation where they're trying to turn things around, it's going to be almost impossible for people inside the org to trust them again. One of the quotes, I said people love quotes, and one of the quotes that I always share is that trust is like a crumpled piece of paper. once it's crumpled up, you can never have it perfect again. And that is how trust works. And when you've had this toxic leader, it's hard to overcome that. It's really hard. And in a small space, you can't afford the mistrust in the time it takes for them to maybe turn themselves around. If you have leaders who are just ineffective or unprepared, then definitely leadership training is the way to go. And you can do this. This doesn't have to be somebody that's brought in to do it. Of course, people who are experts in this, their programs are going to be very robust. They've got tried and true trainings. They know how to go from leadership 101 all the way up through communication, collaboration, those things. But if you don't have the budget for that, or you don't have the ability, then you can look at learning management systems, LinkedIn Learning. As long as it's curated, as long as you know and you have a plan for these are the lessons that we're going to take somebody through, then you can really do it in any way. It could just even be podcasts, blogs, whatever it is. Again, small changes are going to make a big difference. The biggest thing that I would suggest is to figure out, what does a leader look like in our business? What are the behaviors that we want a leader to exhibit? And then how do we train and hold them accountable to that? So what are the behaviors that we think are important for our organization? How do we train those? Do we need to train those, or do people already have them? How do we train them? And then how do we hold people accountable to them? So if you can get your leaders on board, if you can get your CEO on board with, yes, we definitely need some development, then those are absolutely the things that I would do is start with the behaviors, figure out what are the behaviors we need to have, and then how do we train those, and then how do we hold accountable to those? And you can do that for a period of 6 months to a year and see a huge shift in the managers and leaders that you have inside your organization. So that was a whole lot of stuff. That was about 45 minutes of stuff. Hopefully that was helpful. If you have any questions, I would love to see them. I'm just going to check out the chat. I see that some of you guys are already putting some things in here. So what do you think is the most overlooked cost of a bad manager in a small business? I think the most overlooked one is that employer branding. I think that that's the one we just don't talk about. We don't think that it affects small businesses. We think that employer branding is a big business idea, and it's not. It's absolutely a small business idea. So I think that we know what it does internally. We know what it does to people internally, and we don't even think about what it does to people externally. On our question, you guys all said keeping a bad manager. Obviously, I agree, since that is the title of this LinkedIn Live. And I think that, you know, when you lose a really good employee in a small business, I certainly don't want to act like that doesn't hurt, because it does. And if you are super small, then it can really hurt. But having somebody around who is constantly doing harm, they're constantly stagnating the business, or you know, just perpetually creating this environment where employees don't want to work in, then that is going to be way more costly over time than having somebody who's just a good manager and really was out of the business. All right, I don't see anything else. Here's the thing. If you all want to connect with us more, that would be fantastic. If we're not already connected on LinkedIn, I would love to do that. If you are not listening to the HR Connection podcast, then please connect with us there. We have an Acacia site. We also have obviously our own site. So however you would love to connect with us, we would love for you to do that. If you have ideas or thoughts on future office hours, hopefully they're super, but future office hours that we could do, topics that you want to hear about, that's what we would love to hear from you. We really are trying to curate our information strictly to small businesses. It's not a place that's talked about often. Most content is focused on large enterprise businesses. And so we're trying to curate our business or our content really in that small business space. So if that is you, if you are managing HR in a 1 to 500 and you have topics that you would love for us to cover, we would love to do that in the future for sure. All right. Thanks so much for being here, and we'll see you next time.